integral lineage, but different than Wilbur's integral theory, which is around Buckminster Fuller, which you guys I'm sure have heard of, and one of the sort of the most powerful thinkers of the 20th century, and did more to shift kind of our understanding of systems and how we engage with them than maybe anybody I know. And so that's the particular path that Gil came up through, and then he spent 35, 40 years in the trenches actually supporting the sustainability in the business context. Pre-Paul Hawkins' Ecology of Commerce, Gil was out there in the field doing this sort of work. And of course, it's kind of a crescendo in your career, I would say, these days with respect to what you actually understand about how this works. And there's an amazing book that you guys should get called The Truth About Green Business. Is it a bestseller yet?
It came and went.
Yeah, it came and went as a bestseller.
I mean, it's done respectable for a business book.
Yeah. So this is really practical, really good, and highly, highly recommended. And so Gil spends his time working with large-scale companies and medium-sized companies to support them to make significant shifts in how they show up in the world from a sustainability standpoint. And he's been embedded in this sort of integral understanding for a long time and has his own very deep spiritual practice, which is based in Judaism, and and brings that depth of presence and sort of incredible discriminating intelligence that is so prevalent within the Jewish tradition to your work. I really appreciated that about you. And as I said earlier, he's been inducted into the Sustainability Hall of Fame with Amory Lovins from Rocky Mountain Institute and Carl Henrik Robert from The Natural Step, of course, and Bob Willard, and who else was
and Ray Anderson.
And Ray Anderson
from
Interface. So you guys are just freaking lucky to get a conversation with Gil. So I'm gonna, in my opinion. So I'm going to shut up, and we're just going to have a little bit of interview. Well, I'll ask a few questions, but then you guys, at any point, just pop up your hands, and we'll just let it go. So thank you for so generously offering your space to these group of folks to support their learning, for creating an environment for us to come together and do this work, which we should do more often. And for, as I said, continuing to mentor me and push the boundaries of how I understand and get this done on the ground. And I guess what I'd like to know is, as you reflect back upon your career and the work that you've done, what would you have liked to have known at the age that these folks are that would have helped you do the work that you're doing even more successfully or even more effectively?
That's a great question. Well, as I sort of think back there, it feels like it just comes around and around and around in cycles. Because each of the things that I think of, well, you know, the awareness of systems, that was a discovery at this age. I was a year out of college when I encountered Bucky's work. And when all my pals went off to the first Rainbow Family gathering in Rocky Mountains, summer of 1972, just shy of 40 years ago, I went off to Southern Illinois University, where Bucky was scholar in residence, to spend a month in a deep dive design charrette for the planet called World Day. So I spend my days in the stacks and doing analysis and mapping systems and so forth. So, you know, I had then the exposure to systems. I had then the powerful experience of the possibility of the human prospect. I love your phrase about the flourishing of humans in nature. What's the adjective?
It's an unprecedented,
The unprecedented
flourishing
of humanity and nature, which is, can you feel how much more engaging and compelling that is than sustainability? Sustainability.
Yeah.
Now, Michael Browngardt, McDonough Browngardt, talks about this. Sustainability is just so boring. You know, how's your relationship with your loved ones? Oh, it's sustainable. No, that's not interesting. The ultimate flourishing of humanity and nature, that's really interesting. That can get people like that, which it did for me, because the experience of that month of deep dive, deep into the rational and the analytic and the quantitative and so forth, just enabled the full expression of the deeply intuitive, which is that this planet can work. In Bucky's formulation, it can work for 100% of humanity. He said the challenge is to build a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Which is pretty good. I tried that out in audiences wherever I speak, and I've never found anybody who's opposed to that. And what was remarkable in the work with him and his team was validating down into the nuts and bolts that that's entirely possible. So that was another experience at this age. And I had glimpses of the experience of the importance of personal practice and spiritual practice and the life of the body as well as the mind. And for me, it's been sort of an ongoing finding and losing that integration over the course of these years. So I told Barrett before lunch I was very moved by the practice we did this morning, so we bring that present again. So what do I wish? I wish I had understood how centrally important at every level that is for me.
When you say that is?
That integration of the personal practice, the interior personal practice and the exterior practice in the world. Because I find that I have sort of, in the cycles of my life, I get entrepreneurial and busy and dive into the work and forget myself. Now, there's an element to that you talked about that is this great immersion in the kind of selfless commitment to the biggest possible game to play. I would have liked to learn better how to hold my own practice alive and vibrant right in that every day, which I'm finally rediscovering in a fairly consistent way. And I'm discovering that it has a remarkable unfolding that goes with it. I can do less and do more.
It's interesting that you say that. In my dialogues with practitioners around the world, some of the most advanced practitioners that I've come across say that they're actually spending more time on their own personal practice in the mornings than they do. They're increasing their personal practice in the mornings, whether it's meditation or Tai Chi or yoga or whatever it is that opens up that depth for them. Because they find that when they go to a client, and a lot of them are consultants at a pretty high level, when they show up, it's like they're offering plutonium. And that they're offering a presence that the client and the teams that they're working with can touch into and go, I want some of that, right? Now, they still need to know their stuff. They need to be experts in the carbon market, or they need to be experts at stakeholder management or restructuring organizations, whatever. You got to have all of that in place. But that combined with this depth of presence is this unstoppable, incredibly powerful one-two punch.
Which is both something that the clients can notice, even if they don't know what it is that they're noticing.
Yeah, sure.
But it's also something that affects how we show up and how we're able to hear, and how we're able to listen, and what distinctions we're able to discern, and how we're able to read a room or understand what it is that somebody's really up to when they say this, what they really mean, something like that. Yeah. So I find the same thing. The more time I spend in meditation, the more time I spend quiet. Even though there's this to-do list sitting back on the desk, it's counterintuitive, quite remarkable.
So personal practice.
Yeah.
Understanding of systems. Those are some of the two main things that you mentioned.
Understanding of the sense of possibility, of what's really possible. And for me, that was a combination, as you talked about, I think very eloquently this morning, of both grounded in both intuition and aspiration, and what I really care about, and data. And so, and I think this is one of the things that I've learned as I reflect on my work that's been a real part of the value that I bring to my clients, is that there's always that combination of the intuitive and the analytic. You know, we live in a society that emphasizes the analytic and thinks that reason is the key to all locks. And we're remarkably not reasonable creatures, but in really good ways, as well as problematic ways. And you know the research better than I do, but there's a lot of research looking at great leadership, great business leadership. And it turns out that the very best are deeply intuitive people. You know, you always hear the clamor for show me the business case, show me the numbers, show me the percentages, but the best of business leaders are deeply intuitive. They'll anchor that intuition in analytics and data. But I think rarely are the best business decisions made based on an analysis. It's based on a sense of what's needed, where the market is, who the customers are, what they want. And then, yeah, then people will go line of evidence to provide the fiduciary certainty or perhaps reassurance to the doubters, or perhaps sort of fine-tuning, well, given that's the direction, what's actually the best path to get there, where you may need more precision. But yeah, in my experience, the people who can marry those two realms bring a great deal to the table.
Fantastic. Questions that have come up so far?
You can give an example of one of the businesses you work with and how maybe you apply that approach to it, so we can see some of the tools.
We've worked with a lot over the last few decades. Early on, mostly with small companies. Actually, I think this has been an evolution of scale if we work with over time. 10 years ago with emerging brands like Odwalla when it was small before it got acquired by Coca-Cola, Equal Exchange, White Wave Foods, and lately, the last 5 years, most of our work has been with fairly large organizations. Most recently, SunPower, the photovoltaic manufacturer, is number 2 probably in the market in the U.S. right now. Steelcase, the furniture manufacturers, Levi Strauss, Hewlett-Packard, eBay, Coca-Cola, the U.S. General Services Administration, which people don't think of as a business, but is actually the largest buyer of stuff in the world. And they are now under an executive order from President Obama that by 2025, 90% of the federal purchasing of stuff for the United States has to be sustainable stuff. That's 95% of $500 billion a year of buying stuff, $500 billion a year. And they're faced with the question of, well, how do you do that? What does it mean? I mean, they know what it means generally, but what does it mean in terms of actual procurement standards? You know, do I buy this chair or that chair? And it's like the I is not the executive in the agency. It's, you know, it's somebody several layers down in the field office and wherever who has a budget and has needs and has to fulfill it. How do you translate the concept into the mechanism of the system? And in their case, how do you do that in a system that has 22 different computer procurement systems that can't talk to each other? You know, and the budget constraints and the people in Congress yelling at you all the time, and. So the challenge in all of our work is how to take the big mind that we talked about this morning, and the systems perspective, and the complex adaptive systems perspective, and the integral perspective, and translate it into the nuts and bolts mechanisms of a business. For Levi's Strauss, they asked us to help them build their first sustainability strategy. 160-some-odd-year-old company, long history of deep social commitment, one of the real pioneers in labor practices and rights of women, gays and other minorities, and it's really embedded in the culture of this company. You walk into their headquarters in San Francisco and you feel it when you walk in the lobby. It's quite remarkable. But they've never had a sustainability strategy. So we work with about 18 or 20 managers from around the world, both in face-to-face meetings and video meetings, to help them articulate that, build it into their business, build it into their brand, and now they're off and running on that with water-less jeans, 41% less water used in the production of jeans, and other ways they're sort of tying it into the whole legacy of Levi's. With another company now, a major manufacturing company, they've asked, actually can't say much about it, but they've asked one extremely deep sustainability question, like what would happen if we did X? Well, if we did X, it would transform their brand, it would transform the marketplace, it would transform the industry, and to do X, they have to redesign everything, ranging from the materials they use, to how they make their product, to how they sell their product, to what relationship they have with their customers and people in their supply chain who sell stuff for them. It's a systems design question. And so to loop around to your question, that's what we're finding happening more and more, is that the companies that are coming to us, these are mostly sole source to us, referral word-of-mouth relationship. They're coming to us now with bigger, deeper, harder questions that are fundamentally much more systemic. It's not like how do we do a green sum. It's how do we look at who we are and what we do in the world and do it in a different way. So it's really juicy. And we're doing, it's harder work than we've ever done. Because the scale is big, the complexity is big, the responsibility is big.
So can you give some increasingly practical examples of sort of what it's actually like on the ground and what specifically you're doing, where you're bringing the systems understanding to shifting the way an organization is showing up?
You know, my bias, and maybe because I started out with a background in physics, is to look at the physical system. And not to elevate that above the social or economic or any other components of the business, but I find it really interesting to start with what actually goes on here. What is the stuff that moves through this organization? You know, what's the energy and the materials that you acquire? What's the product and non-product that you produce? What happens along the way? Who's involved along the way? At a very gross level, that starts to reveal things, because it's just a little. You've seen me do this sketch before, but it's always funny. If this is your company, I would say that there are two things that go in and two things that go out. Whatever business you're in, whether you're a steel mill or a hotel or an academic institution or cafe. You tell me.
Material inputs.
Yeah.
People. Labor.
Labor. Yeah. And energy. And actually people are a reflection of both of these. Yeah, there's a mass of people that comes in every day, and there's the amount of energy, the potential energy we're loaded with. That's what comes in, and what comes out.
Waste.
Yeah. What's waste? What is waste? What does that mean?
Anything that's not in the product.
Not useful anymore.
Anything that's not useful anymore. There's no such thing as waste anymore. There's such a thing as a weed. You talked about this whole thing, right? I mean, a rose in your garden is a thing of beauty and joy forever. A rose in a field is a weed. There's no taxonomic botanical difference between a weed and a not weed. It's contextual. So what comes out is the product, the things that you're intending to produce. And the non-product, which you call waste, which is the stuff that you can't sell. And there's, if you did a pie chart for the U.S. economy to look at what's the ratio of product to non-product in the U.S. economy, I don't know the numbers for Canada, what would you think the percentage is?
5 5% product, maybe 5% non-product.
Anybody else?
50-50.
Yeah. Anybody else?
70-30?
Which way?
70% waste, 30% product?
Okay. You're an advanced group, and you got it right, or very close to right at the start. It's about 6%. So one of the places we started to say, what does this look like for you? I've yet to find a CEO, with the exception of Ray Anderson at Interface, I've yet to find a CEO who knew what that percentage was for their company. And when they do, they fall off their chairs. Because they recognize in a heartbeat that this makes no sense. Sustainability aside, from a business perspective, this makes no sense because you bought energy, you bought materials, you paid for labor, and you paid for management and plant and equipment and so forth. And only this is adding value to your customers and your shareholders, and this isn't. And it's, so I like to start there. And sometimes we will take this schematic and bring together a cross-functional team from all across the company, different perspectives of view of what a company is, and ask people to think about what's actually happening here and what's important financially, in terms of brand, in terms of customer experience, in terms of their reason for being there. And we start to think together overlaid onto a physical map to surface the kinds of concerns that you guys were talking about earlier this morning.
So there's a very practical integral move right there, is to bring in all the different voices of the system, so to speak. So bring in the folks that are interested and know about the people side of the business, and those that know about the operations and strategies side of the business. And then by having those different perspectives in the room, you have a stronger chance of having good collective intelligence show up, because different people see different perspectives.
It's like the old story of the blind man and the elephant, whereas my friend Carol Moore said, none of us is as smart as all of us. And it's remarkable to see that, often these meetings are high-level execs or people focused on design and operations and plant and equipment and so forth, but somebody in purchasing or somebody who loads boxes on a truck or a secretary in the accounting department, every one of these people has a view that often isn't there among the leadership. And so being able to reach wide and deep and break the hierarchy and not just take people who are ranking and supposedly high level is really enlightening. It's really enlightening. Because it turns out that people tend to know their jobs pretty well. Somebody who's been operating a machine or working a part of an accounting procedure or something like that for a year, 2 years, or 5, or 10 years, or 20 years actually knows a lot about what's working and what's not working. And so then the inquiry is into, well, what do you do? Why are you doing it this way? For the sake of what? Which is to say, what are you trying to accomplish by doing it this way? So you start to unpack the automaticity to get to, to your point, what do you care about? What are the concerns that drive you? Why are we doing this thing? Ultimately, where we try to get to at some point in the conversation is to a very simple and I think really powerful question, which is, what are you really here to do? First time I asked a client, it was a private coaching relationship with an executive at a biotech company. And I asked her that, and she stopped and she said, what do you mean? And bless my heart, for the first time in a long time as a consultant, I did what consultants never do. I kept my mouth shut. Just didn't say anything. And she started to ask again, and then she stopped. She knew I wasn't going to say anything. And then it was a very interesting, energetic process to observe. I observed her get quiet. I observed her go interior. I observed the space shift in the room. The phenomenon of rapt focus, and you'll be making focus just kind of shifts. But the energy shifted in the room. And her eyes went back in her head, and she said, oh. Actually, before that, she said, you mean in my job? I didn't answer. She said, you mean in my community? I didn't answer. She said, oh. And she went down to the core of what's she up to in her life, in the world. Why is she in this job in this company at this time? What is she trying to accomplish in relation to that and her career and her family and things she cares about? Which then leads to a discussion of what's the company here for? And we've been sold a bill of goods about this. We've all thought, I don't know how it is with you all in Canada, but here in the United States, the operating mythos is that the purpose of business is to maximize return to shareholders. Period. That's the only thing that matters. The fiduciary duty of directors of public corporations is to maximize return to shareholders. That's actually a legal requirement in more than half of our states. But the notion is not an old notion. It dates mostly back to Milton Friedman in the early 1970s. And it's a very weak and limited perspective on what an organization is. What's much more interesting, in my experience, is what's it here to do? What's it for? A.P. Giannini, who founded the Bank of America across the bay about 135 years ago, said that the purpose of the bank is not to maximize return to investors. That the purpose of the bank is to provide credit facilities for immigrant communities in San Francisco who don't have access to credit. Cascade of thinking, then if money is the purpose. I mean, Michael Jordan never went out on the basketball court saying, my goal today is to score as many baskets as I possibly can. Although he scored baskets, his goal was to play great ball with a team that knew how to work together as a team. And it was a joy in his life. I know, by the way, win games, score baskets, make lots of money. But what's the animating purpose and what's the consequence gets mixed up a lot. So I like to go from the basic physics to the heart of the matter. In the context of a business, the business translation of that question is, what business are you really in? What's the problem you're solving in the world? What's the service that you're fulfilling? Even if you're selling a thing, like a camera, The purpose of the thing is what it enables somebody to do with it. Emily Lovins, who you mentioned before, is fond of saying that people don't need natural gas and electricity from utility companies. What they need is hot shower and cold beer. Nobody cares how many kilowatt hours they buy as a commodity that you want to own. It's what it does for you. If I can help you get cold beer with a tenth of the electricity, are you unhappy? Of course not. The problem with most businesses is that most businesses are set up that in order to make more money, you have to sell more stuff, right? From an ecological perspective, the problem with that is that more stuff means more impact. Every kilogram moved every kilometer, all other things being equal, means more resource consumption and more environmental impact. So we've got a systems problem here. We want to reduce impact, but the entire economic system is organized to increase impact. So that means we need to redesign things. We need to reinvent how we do that, and to do that you have to step back and say, for the sake of what? As Bob Dunham would say, what's the point of this? What's the purpose we're trying to fulfill? What's the value we're trying to deliver to our customers, which is to say, what do our customers really care about? What do they really want from us? How do we fulfill them, and in the process fulfill us, and in the process of that fulfill our shareholders? So that's the background of the conversation that we're having all the time. The foreground of the conversation is how do we organize your systems to enable that to happen? How do we rethink the value proposition? The means of fulfilling that, whether it's a product or a service. If it's a product, can we do it without product by providing a service instead of a product? The most obvious example in everybody's experience is car rental versus car ownership, which has now moved from renting by the day to renting by the hour or ephemeral, which from a business perspective means better capital utilization because a finite pool of stuff can serve more people more effectively. And that opens up terrific opportunities for companies like Zipcar and City Car Share in the transportation space, or companies like Airbnb or Couchsurfing in the hospitality space, and dozens of other companies that are doing this. And it raises a great disruptive challenge because while it may be great for Zipcar, it may not be so great for General Motors. Because what happens if North America needs 1/10 the cars in order to have a vibrant, effective, highly transported lifestyle? Well, Zipcar grows, but what happens to GM? So
we have a situation like that happened recently with Kodak, actually. Kodak invented the digital camera and just went bankrupt in December because they couldn't ever capitalize on the digital camera space.
And sometimes what happens there is that the innovators don't want to capitalize on it because it will cannibalize the legacy business. And this is something we're dealing with in just 1 second with some of our clients right now, where they say, if we do X, we're going to be competing with ourselves, and we're going to kill our own business. We can't do that. And you can imagine what our response to them usually is. It's, well, great, I understand, and you can decide not to do it, but you can't decide for your competitors not to do it. Or you can't decide for some upstart startup in Silicon Valley to do it and blow away your business, so you better do it first. You better understand the needs, use your experience, in the case of Kodak, technology experience, to capture that market, blow up your own bridges, and move forward. It takes a certain amount of courage, obviously. And that word is coming up much more in our conversations this last year. People say, well, kind of what's the key quality of
courage,
of great leadership? So ultimately it comes down to courage in both the sense of bravery, but also in the original sense of from the heart. And a leader who can actually embody that fully and speak to what is motivating them and do it in the face of uncertainty and fear, which is just going to be a given in this world, brings something very different to the room than those who are more focused on hedging their bets and cutting costs and reducing risk. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you thought that a business with the main purpose of capital accumulation can be sustainable.
I think I was speaking to that. Let me try to say it in another way. I don't think businesses whose sole purpose is capital accumulation will in the long run be as successful as those who have a deeper purpose. There's a book called The High Purpose Company by Christine Arena, one of our board members, who's done some deep research on comparing companies now. kind of axis. The problem, I think, with the situation that you're raising is that myopia is dangerous in a complex and uncertain world. And if a business focuses solely on that single factor, what can happen, and I would argue what we see happening around us, is they become blind to other factors. Blinders on and say, well, it's just business, man, nothing personal, it's just business. I got to do this to maximize return. Environmental impacts, social impacts, cost of what we economists can be, we call externalities. That's somebody else's problem, not mine. I'm just going to focus here. And then you find companies walking inadvertently into disasters, large and small. And it could be big disaster like the Bhopal plant in India blowing up some years ago. It was a disaster for Union Carbide. It could be disaster small, like losing market share, failing to understand market movements, failing to understand regulatory trends. When the European Union promulgated the WEEE directive in 2005, the Waste Electronics and Equipment, Electrical Equipment Directive that required recycling of all that stuff in Europe, followed a year later by the ROS Directive, which required that electronics sold in Europe not include lead, cadmium, mercury, hexavalent chromium, and 2 polybrominated nasty chemicals. Those have been on the drawing boards for years. People knew they were coming. 6 weeks before the WEEE directive triggered, 44% of the global electronics industry said we're not prepared to comply. 1/3 of their global market at risk. And they said, we don't know how to do this. We can't do this. It's not economic, it's not technically feasible, all that stuff. Fascinating, because on the one hand, if 44% weren't ready, well, 56% were ready. So you can't say it's impossible. Ken Boulding said years ago that existence is proof of the possible. If it's there, you can't tell me it can't be there. And so 56% were ready, and included companies like HP, which said this is a profit opportunity. Let's make a joint venture with Noranda Mining and Metallics and see Europe as a mine from which we can harvest precious metals, and let's make it a profit center. So some folks are moaning and bellyaching and spending their money on lawyers and lobbyists saying, please hold off the inevitable. And some folks are saying, it's inevitable, let's take advantage of it. And some folks, in particular companies who had been working with the natural step, knew 15 years before the regulations were even proposed where they were going to go. Because they knew from looking at the fundamental science of this that at some point we're going to see cadmium, lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, and other things leave commerce. Why? Because they're not compatible with life. And you know that from biology, and it's not a matter of political bias or political perspective, just their cells can't metabolize cadmium. So do you want a company that depends on using more and more and more of that to produce its return to shareholders? Or do you want a company that is going to be gradually reducing the amount of that they need to produce the return to shareholders? Which is going to be more viable in the long term? Which is going to be able to handle the risks better? Which is going to be able to ride the regulations better? Which is going to be able to capture markets better? So the companies that said, we got to focus on short-term return to shareholders, don't bother me with this other stuff, wound up actually hurting returns to shareholders. So that's one example. I think that perspective is what we would generalize from, that single-minded focus on a narrow point of return can blind an organization to the larger landscape and larger systems and the other points of opportunity they may be playing with. Yeah.
How much of this shift in willingness to embrace these kind of natural logic and natural business models do you think is based on true courage of these corporations, and how much is just that there's become a market for this and that you are more, you have the potential to have more success because there is that drive to move towards this, I don't want to use the word sustainability now that it's been labeled as boring, but
Flourishing.
Flourishing, yes, economic system,
Yeah.
systems in general.
I think it's all of those and others. And we're complex creatures and we have multiple motives for what we do, and sometimes we know them and sometimes we don't. So you know, there's courage, there's trendiness, there's regulatory pressure, there's competitive pressure, there's, you know, there's recognizing the shifting resource economics that a growing planet is facing. There's drive for innovation. There's sense of purpose from individuals. There's the cultural shifts. You mentioned earlier that the, I don't know if it was in the group or when we spoke earlier, that the kind of reaction that you're seeing to the big mind exercise in the groups that you're talking with is very different now than it was even 5 years ago.
Sure.
So there's, you know, shift in cultural awareness and cultural acceptance. There's multiple factors in the culture. There's different factors between different companies. There's different factors for different people within companies. This gets back to the work that Barrett was talking about of the developmental levels and the different ways of articulating and communicating with people who have different levels of development or cultural styles, or you'll see this most obviously in the form of language. You wouldn't go to Portugal and try to talk to somebody in Japanese. Sort of obvious. And yet, in our day-to-day discourse, you know, if I'm talking to you and if I'm trying to talk to you in my language and my metaphors about my concerns, I'm much less likely to be able to engage and communicate with you than if I hear you and hear your concerns, but even more feel you and get a sense of the way you hold your body, the kinds of language you use, the metaphors you use, what your energy feels like. So being able to at least sense that is really key. And being able to dance with that is even richer. And so that happens at the level of an interpersonal interaction, but it also happens with the culture of an organization.
Let me add a practical example. So what I heard Gil say, part of what I heard Gil say was that it's all of that and more because we're complex. And I would complement that with it also doesn't matter where they're coming from as long as they're behaving in a way that is supporting the emergence of tools and organizations, be who they are, and still play in the sustainability game is actually a really critical kind of Jedi move in this process. And the way that we did that in the work that I was just doing, I was just explaining this to Malcolm, we built large-scale systems or large-scale market transformation programs that were about literally mainstreaming sustainability into global supply chains. So for the production of cotton, we work with Levi, for tea, cocoa, aquaculture, tropical timber, all these sort of big global agro-commodities, right? We worked with the entire system to build a sustainability program that would go after the social, economic, and environmental issues in the global supply chain. So whether farmers had a bad economic model, or when they were poor, or whether there was too much chemicals going out into the tea fields, getting into the local watersheds, right? We would identify all those issues and then basically build 10 to 20 million euro programs that would go after those issues collectively. The reason why it's working, and you can go check it out online, is the Sustainable Trade Initiative. That's what it's called. It's based in the Netherlands. But the reason why it's working is because of this natural integral approach that they're using. And we call this folk integral, which means it's because integral is a developmental stage where you just start recognizing all of these different aspects of reality. The cultural issues are important, the systems issues are important, the psychological issues are important, the behavioral issues are important. At some point, kind of consciousness just kind of gets that. It doesn't need frameworks that lay it out like that. It just gets it and starts operating from that place. And so what we literally did was that we brought together NGOs and government and corporations and academia to build and execute these programs. However, everybody was allowed to be there for their reasons. So the classic, what's happened traditionally in sort of the NGO corporate space is this clash between NGOs saying, taking the high road, taking the ethical high road, saying you should friggin' care about what's happening in Africa, or you should care about the deforestation in the Amazon, or you should care about the chemicals that are leaking into the very people that are producing.
And you should care about it enough to be willing to sacrifice some of your profits to go to the whole.
Exactly. Right. So that's the classic sort of NGO push. So, because they're coming from an authentic, world-centric space of care and compassion. Right? companies and the individuals in them, sometimes there are people in those companies that authentically hold that space, but lots of times they're not. And so the companies that were engaged in these programs, and they were willing to invest literally millions and millions and millions of dollars in these sustainability programs, they did it for their reasons, which were modern worldview reasons, meaning that they were business savvy reasons, like risk mitigation. You don't want crap in your supply chain that some NGO watchdog is going to do a documentary on and hurt your market price, right? So there's a risk mitigation piece. There's a brand reputation reason for them doing it. There's just pure supply chain efficiency, which means that it's just going to cost you less money to get your product. And then there's supply chain security, meaning that you have access to sustainably produced bananas or sustainably produced tea, right? Because that's an increasingly rare commodity and increasingly greater demand from the market for that sort of stuff. So they were there for very solid business reasons. And then the governments were there for their reasons as well, to protect the local industries, to support economic development, to get votes. Didn't matter where they were coming from. What mattered was that they were taking steps collectively together toward these common objectives of, okay, let's get 250,000 Kenyan tea farmers certified in Rainforest Alliance production practices so that we can then have this supply of certified sustainable tea coming through the system. Everybody wanted that, but for their own reasons. For the NGOs, it's because it helped to advance the Millennium Development Goals by reducing poverty. For the companies, it's because it secured supply access for them and gave them this great story. Right? For the government, it was because they were supporting economic development. And so it's critical to understand these different developmental levels that are at play in the market and then align those values toward the common objective. But we don't have to transform everybody so they care as deeply as you care.
Or care about the same things that you care about, or care about the same things that you care about in exactly the same way that you care about. We've also seen NGOs that kind of got trapped down the road. Right? So, yeah, I don't care as much about people's motives. That's about how they show up in the world and what they're going to do, how they want to express those motives in action and relationship in the world. That said, I'm finding a lot more commonality of motive than it seems. And that the business concern with profit or risk or market share, and without talking about purpose, for the NGO concern, the government concern, in part is because we are, again, assuming that these things are at odds. I don't dare talk about purpose in the world as a human being working for a Coca-Cola, for example, because I'm responsible for the record of the results that the analysts want to see on Wall Street. And the assumption is that these are somehow at odds. And so to be a realistic grown-up person, I've got to focus on the real stuff of economics and not the soft stuff of human motivation. But what if they're not at odds? What if they support each other? What if they reinforce each other? What if that personal concern actually drives innovation or drives the discovery of new opportunities, new ways to deliver value to a population that produces more sales and produces more profit? So there's a value at some point, sometimes, to dive beyond the obvious motives. And my friend and former partner, Bill Reed, who was one of the founders of the Green Building Movement in the United States, talks about an engagement he did some years back with a private school in northeastern United States. The school was very well regarded in its community, decided they needed to expand for a variety of reasons, put their plans before the zoning board, and they were surprised that the NIMBYs came out of the woodwork. You know the term NIMBY for Canada, not in my backyard. All these friends and neighbors said, "You're not going to do that." And people started pulling their lawyers out of their holsters, and it was getting fairly ugly. And Bill got brought in to do a whole community, full stakeholder intervention. And I'm going to sort of cartoonize the story just a little bit for the sake of time. But basically, he walked into the room, locked the door, and said, Barrett, why are you in favor of this? And you give your reasoning. Why are you in favor of it? And why are you against it? And why are you against it? And kind of went around the room with everybody giving their reasons for being for or against. And it was all known stories. And he went around again. Barrett, what's the reason for that objection? And went around again and just sort of peeled the layers. So somebody didn't want it because, well, it would mean more roads. And they didn't want more roads, it would mean more traffic. They didn't want more traffic because it would mean, it would mean more threat for their kids who are playing near the streets. And so they just peeled the layers again and again, went around the room again and again over the course of 2 days, till they got to the point where everybody basically had the same expressed concern. Not exactly in the same words, but very close concerns about the quality of life in their community, the concern for their kids, both their kids' safety and their kids' education. And Bill looked around the room and said, okay, now let's start the design process. Not until the common concerns were on the table, which were there even in a situation that was about to go to litigation. So sometimes it's fine to accept the different concerns if there's a common agenda that can be found in it. Sometimes it's actually worth getting behind the motivation that people are bringing to the table. Because then, what happened in that case was a design that was already extremely energy efficient, water efficient, land efficient, ecologically sensitive, all kinds of ways, became 40% more so on all those measures because of the quality of design that came to the table. Malcolm?
Oh, I was just nodding.
Okay.
Very much so.
Other questions, comments? Can I just check in and see if there's some other questions? Because you already asked one.
Yeah.
Have you had a chance to work with any businesses where the product is greater than the non-product, or that the non-product is actually part of the material in that sort of framework?
Well, the 6%, 94% percentage is not the percentage for individual companies necessarily, it's the society as a whole. So some of it is a private measure, some of it is broader. A lot of it is hard to capture because it includes things like water and gaseous emissions and so forth. So with that caveat, it varies. Different companies vary. Different industries vary. And so one of the things that's useful to do is say, let's look at how you compare to your competitors. Or let's look at how facilities or divisions within your organization compare to each other. If you're looking at it from an investment point of view, if you're going to decide what industries you want to invest your money in, this might be one of the kind of vulnerabilities that you consider. So, for example, a company called Innovest some years ago developed a metric called carbon beta, which looked at carbon emissions monetized. They figured, did an estimated monetization based on carbon trading prices and so forth. Said if your carbon emissions computed to a dollar value compared to your profit. And went to that ratio and use that as a major filter in guiding investment, the theory being that if that ratio was worse, you're probably a riskier investment. And it's bad. An examples of differences across sectors, obviously a service business can be a very different mix, very different footprint than a manufacturing business. And this analysis becomes a little metaphoric in the case of the service business. If it's a university, so what's the product? Educated minds might be the product. Or for some universities, it's educated minds who get jobs within a certain amount of time. And what's the non-product? It might be dropouts.
Educated minds that don't get jobs.
Educated minds that don't get jobs, or minds that are uneducated, or people who drop out, or So I don't want to push the metaphor too far, but I think this gets people to think about what is it that we're really trying to do? What's the intended outcome? Well, instead of product, you could say intended outcome of all of our efforts. What's the result we're trying to produce? Living in the middle of this with the question of what do we do? Think of what else to do other than to be in this game doing the best I can, without any certainty about how the odds are going to play out. Partly it's because I just wouldn't feel satisfied with myself if I wasn't working on this. But part of it is that I can't imagine anything more interesting, more challenging, more compelling than trying to transform the economy of an entire planet. This planet in one generation. That's what I think the task is. That's sort of the expression of it that I've distilled in this last year about what is it that we're really up to? What's that? And then that opens up a pretty vast opportunity of systems design and evolution in every dimension we can imagine. Because, the economies of planets do evolve. We've seen that. We see it in this one, but it's rarely consciously. It's rarely with this kind of, with the kind of purpose that Bucky articulated in mind. And that's the opportunity we have. How well we do that determines whether it's going to get better or get worse. So no, I don't know if that's a good answer to your question. That's how I see it. You know, it's a mixed bag every day. Barrett talked about earlier as we were going through that exercise. I was just thinking of the cycles of hope and despair that I've gone through. You know, year by year, sometimes day by day.
Let's take 2 more questions, then we'll wrap up.
So this is really interesting because with sustainability, it's like there's a 3 sort of circle model, like one of many, but like economics, society, social justice, and environment, right? And if those things can be in balance, then that's essentially like could be a sustainable world. And so this is really interesting to hear the economics of the perspective, especially at such a high scale of corporations and NGOs. But I know I don't really understand economics very well, but I know one of the ideas is that if you don't make a profit off something that can be profitable, then somebody else will. So it's kind of like competitive, and you got to get in there and dig for yourself, otherwise it belongs to somebody else. And I know with the exploitation of like resources, like say like the mines and all that and stuff. Is there a way that economics can shift to like have a cap on that to retain like
cap on what?
Like cap on the
resources.
Resources, yeah, so that we're not overutilizing and overtaking more than is sustainable, because that value will continue to exist. So how can that be protected, or like the B2B value?
Let me respond to you in 2 ways. I want to start with the second half of your question first, and then come back to the first half. One of the fundamental problems with resources is that we don't pay the true costs of anything. So the market can't work. Simple example, a gallon of gasoline runs about $4 or $4.50 a gallon in California right now. But the actual cost of gasoline, if you consider not just the refining and delivery of it, but if you consider the pollution and health effects, and the cleaning costs, and oh yes, the military costs of keeping supply chains open in the Persian Gulf, estimates bring it to somewhere between $15 and $20 a gallon. $4.50 at the pump, $20 real cost. So how can a market work effectively if the prices are that distorted? If you had to pay $20, any of you own cars? You're Canadians, not Californians. See this. Would you own the car you own today if you had to pay $20 a gallon for gasoline? It's a really stupid question. You know, everybody knows the answer. Would anybody be making the car you're making today if we had to pay $20 a gallon for gasoline? No. So the feedback in the system, the price signals that the prices provide in the marketplace are a real significant factor in that. So yeah, maybe you put a cap on things, or maybe you put a price on things. With a price on things, then there's an incentive for competition to develop more efficient ways of delivering services and drive down resource use. Absent that, we're in a world problem. Anything of the limits to growth study from the early 1970s? Arthur does. Take a look at it. Limits to growth, Danella Meadows and Dennis Meadows and Jorgen Randers, I think was the third guy's name. They did a series of systems dynamic models projecting economic growth and resource use over coming decades. They've gotten beat up a lot for it, but there was a new report that just came out showing that their projections are pretty much on target in terms of the trends in resource use, decline of resource reserves, prices of things, and so forth. So when you make everything free, people use whatever they use. If you make it cost, people make decisions. So that's one thing that has to happen. I don't think you can actually put, I don't think there's a mechanism to impose a cap, because there's no way to enforce that. I also personally don't think that central planning is as smart as markets when markets have the accurate data. So that's to that point. The thing about profit and competition, I think this is, profit's something that's gotten a real bad name in the NGO community. I mentioned before that one of the places one of the legacies that I work from is physics. One of the legacies I work from is biology, in particular evolutionary biology, and how living systems work. I should let him in on the secret.
You should.
So the secret is this: is that Earth's living systems have 3.8 billion years of experience in operating systems that are efficient and adaptive and resilient and productive. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, the R&D's already been done. It's actually open source, free R&D. It's there. Okay. One of the things we see in living systems that there in fact is profit. So, organisms eat food and store up fat or store up endosperm in the seed to be able to support a next generation. There's accumulation of what Bucky would call forward days survival capacity. That was his definition of wealth. And so for survival to happen and adaptation to happen and for organisms to be able to thrive in the face of competition, they need to be able to accumulate some level of resource to enable them to do that. Now, and I think that's analogous to profit. But again, profit's not the purpose of a company any more than paying the utility company for the electricity that runs the computers of the company is the purpose of the company. You have to pay for your electricity. You have to pay for your capital. How do you pay for your capital? You give dividends to investors. You share that accumulated wealth with them. One of the places where things look really different in human economic systems than in natural systems, and I owe this to Jan Hanhart from the Netherlands, who said that in living systems there's this notion of satiation. Animal jumps out of their den, chases down a gazelle, kills the gazelle, drags it back to the pride. Everybody eats real well, and then what does the animal do? Does it go out and hunt down another gazelle, or does it go to sleep? There's enoughness. There's not, you don't store and store and store without limit. We seem to do that because in our world, value is abstract. And so I think there's a really, not just a tolerable, but a really important place for profit in the system as a signal. But profit unrestrained, or profit as the only goal that companies are pursuing, is problematic. Competition, again, let's look at living systems. If you look at ecosystems, we see competition, we see collaboration, we see altruism, we see intentional collaboration, and collaboration is just sort of wired into the mechanisms of systems. So in fact, in our world, we're going to see all of those things. And it's a question of how you design the mix in your world. I'm a little, back to the first thing you said, I'm a little wary about talk about balance. Whether it's of the three rings or work-life balance that people talk a lot about. Because balance implies a trade-off. That I have to have less of this if I'm going to have more of that. Well, what if it wasn't about balance? What if it was about innovation and design and inventing new ways to do things? So instead of having less of this to get more of that, what if I could have more of all this? What if I could have the ultimate flourishing of human and natural systems on this planet?
Let's take a last question, and we're going to shift to experiential.
Well, I have a question, but if there's a student that has one, I'd rather...
He's no student.
I'm an old student. I honestly believe you read in your sleep. I don't know anyone who reads as more prodigiously than you do.
Oh, Barrett.
So if we... a new one. We have to get to know each other.
Sean, actually.
My
the one that reads more than
it's a lineage.
It's a lineage, okay. In the consulting business, when you get to that point that the client is close to making a decision, but is emotionally unable in the moment to make a decision, what do you do? What do you fall back on? What do you try? What do you even give space for and walk away? How do you handle that situation when you're so close and you just don't, you haven't closed yet? Which I know rarely happens to you.
No. Well, it's a great question. I don't know how much time we have for this one.
Not a lot.
Yeah. Not like 2 hours.
No.
Okay.
How about a couple of minutes?
I mean, the first answer, Arthur, is the standard consultant answer to almost any question, which is, it depends. But to be serious about it, let's be serious about it depends. But I think what's common, at least for me in that situation, is compassion. Is understanding them and understanding where they are and what the challenges they are having in reaching a decision is. Sometimes they're the decision maker, sometimes they've got to influence somebody else in the organization. So understanding the whole set and circumstance of what are their concerns. What are they worried about? What are they afraid about? What do they not know how to do? Who do they not know how to influence? In the best of circumstances, the client that we're working with is our ally, and we are their ally, and they're our champion in the company, and we are their helper in accomplishing what they're trying to accomplish in the company. So in the best of circumstances, we think together about how do we shape and offer together they can bring to the decision makers in their company to get something approved. So that would be one path where the person is the decision maker. Trying to remember a specific one. Fundamentally, we want to get really clear on what they care about in all its dimensions. Why are they even in conversation with us? What are they trying to accomplish? Where do they want to get us to? What is their aspiration of what this could do for them, for their company, for the things that matter to them? Where do they see barriers? What holds them back? What are they afraid of? And in the best of circumstances, it's a mutual design process of getting things surfaced into consciousness, getting them clear, and then dealing with them one by one. Sometimes, and so it's sort of a dance that we've been doing here, so sometimes it's design of lots of specific pieces to advance the supply chain programs that we're talking about. Sometimes it's more of a aha level of we really need to do this. Another version, I guess, of the purpose conversation. Like, why are we here? What are we really trying to do? Will this potential engagement help you do that? If so, just the first question would be how do we move that forward in the world? So, I guess the answer is kind of like you can do anything with anybody. If you're Walmart, you can bring down the hammer and say, you have to do this. Most of us have to actually engage people and find a common purpose and find a basis for cooperation, find a way to stand shoulder to shoulder together and move forward together.
Thank you.
Can we sneak Cam in?
We can move. I'll ask you.
Okay, fair enough.
Mano a mano.
Fair enough.
So thank you
Glad
very much.
Yeah. And all that stuff if you want to follow more about us. And we're in regular communication, so if we can be helpful to you guys.